The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
My own interest in these subjects began when, at Cambridge, I was doing research on plant morphogenesis, the development of plants. I started my work in pursuit of, I started off as a mechanist. I was quite an ardent mechanist. I believed that all these things could be explained in terms of chemicals. And when I was starting out in this research, there was a sort of evangelical spirit with the growth of molecular biology about how everything could soon be understood in terms of genes and chemicals. In plants, it was discovered in the 1930s that the principal hormone that shapes developing plants is called auxin. Chemically, it's called indole acetic acid. And I was working on the synthesis of auxin. I was trying to work out how this key chemical was made in plants. I made a rather astonishing discovery. I found that it's made by dying cells, that as they die, they release this chemical which stimulates further growth and development. So death and life are interlinked. I also studied how it moves around the plant. It moves in a polar manner. And one of the key things about plants and animals is their polarity. The next slide. This shows the regeneration of a number of plant tissues. Here's a piece of willow stem, and if you ring it around here, what happens is that shoots come out of the top bit and roots out of the bottom. Here again you see this section here in this dandelion root, where the shoots come out of the top, and they come out of the top bits of a cut surface here, and the roots come out of the lower bits. There's a kind of polarity within the tissue. This has nothing to do with gravity, because you can turn them upside down and you still get the same pattern. It's not a gravitational thing. There's an inherent polarity in the tissue. All organisms contain a polarity. We have three kinds of polarity: head, foot, front, back, and then left, right. And plants have these kinds of polarity too. So these fields appear to be polar. It's an inherent feature. Auxin moves in a polar way. The tissue is already polar, and it makes the auxin move towards the base of the plant, where it stimulates roots to form. It's like the north and south pole of a magnet. Anyway, I was working on auxin, and I worked out how it was made. I also managed to figure out the mechanism of the polar transport system. This is something that I did. It's in plant physiology textbooks. It's my most successful piece of conventional biological research. But the trouble is that having worked all this out, I then realized it doesn't really solve the problem, because auxin's the same in all plants. The very same auxin is present in every kind of plant, including ferns. And yet, plants have different shapes. If we take leaves, for example, here's an oak leaf, and this, I suppose, is a maple. The leaves are a different shape, yet they both have the same auxin. It moves according to the same mechanism from the tip towards the base. So that itself can't explain the shape. Something else must be explaining the shape. Auxin helps correlate things. It helps make roots form when they're needed. And if there's more shoots, you get more roots. But it doesn't explain the shape. Also, if you look at leaves from the same tree, these are oak leaves from the same tree, each leaf is different. It's not some rigid program that's involved. And somehow in each leaf, the auxin is serving a function, but it's not determining the specific shape. These chemicals are no magic solution to the problem of form. I think there must be morphogenetic fields involved in the development of these organs and in plant and animal morphogenesis. The same principles apply to crystals. Crystals have forms, and these forms have a holistic property too. This is a picture of some snow crystals. And the interesting thing about snow crystals is that each one is different. Yet the different arms of each crystal are the same. They're symmetrical. Now, how does this happen? Nobody understands this to this day. There are profound mysteries still in chemistry about the nature of form and how it arises. You see, if you say, well, this is different from this crystal because there are chance fluctuations when it was forming, caused this arm to form differently from that arm, that's okay. You can say they're different because of chance fluctuations. But how come all the arms are the same? It means that as the arms grow, there must be a correlation between the arms somehow. There's a relationship over quite large distances, several millimeters, between these growing arms. It's not just a matter of random aggregation of water molecules to give chance patterns. So crystals, too, require some kind of coordinating field to explain how the different arms are correlated. And nobody understands how this kind of crystal can form in conventional chemical terms. The next slide shows the way in which morphogenetic fields must be organized hierarchically. Everything in nature is organized hierarchically or holarchically. At every level, there's a wholeness that's more than the sum of the parts. For example, this could be a subatomic particle inside an atom. These could be atoms inside a molecule. These could be molecules inside a crystal. And at each level, there's an organization of wholeness more than the sum of the parts. What I'm suggesting is that at each level of organization, there's fields, coordinating fields. So there are atomic fields, molecular fields, and crystal fields. Or these could be organelles inside cells, inside tissues, inside organs. So the parts of the whole are themselves wholes at a lower level. So this can be called a nested hierarchy. And it's the way the whole of nature is organized. Think of it, social groups. This could be a society of organisms. And the next level would be an ecosystem. Then you have larger ecosystems. Then everything's within Gaia, the planet. Then that's within the solar system. That's within the galaxy. We have these levels of organization all through nature. Old-style mechanistic science is reductionistic. It tries to explain everything in terms of the smallest possible component, on the grounds that if you get to the smallest thing, you're home and dry. And at first people thought you could explain everything in terms of atoms. Then the bottom dropped out of the atom, and we got lots and lots of subatomic particles. And then those split up further. And the only limit to how many subatomic particles we can find is not set by nature, but rather by the willingness of the US Congress to go on funding ever larger accelerators. And so there seems that's not the way we're going to explain it, but there's still a very powerful reductionistic cast of mind within conventional science, which is why biology is now almost totally dominated by the molecular biology approach. Molecules are the smallest things inside organisms, therefore they're considered to be the most important to study, as if you can build up an understanding of everything just from molecules. The holistic approach, which many people have suggested, not just me, is that there's many levels in nature, and we need to understand what the wholeness of things is that makes them more than the sum of the parts. And I'm suggesting that wholeness depends on the morphogenetic field. The field of the whole system coordinates the parts. And they, in turn, have fields which coordinate their parts, and so on. So there's a nested hierarchy, or to use Arthur Koestler's word, holarchy of fields. So I think that morphogenetic fields work by modifying probabilities of the systems under their influence. This is something I discuss in detail in my book, The Presence of the Past, which is my main theoretical work and deals with the nature of these fields. How they work is by everything is indeterminate in nature. We now know that rigid determinism was a fantasy of 19th century physicists. It doesn't occur anywhere. In the quantum level, we have probability. Everything's probabilistic or indeterminate. And the discovery of chaos within science, and chaos theory, has highlighted the fact that most things in nature don't behave in a predictable mechanistic way. In fact, the only things that behave in a totally predictable mechanistic way are machines, and even they break down sometimes in an unpredictable manner. Even the solar system, which was the set piece of Newtonian physics, turns out to have a chaotic dynamics. It's not simply predictable in terms of standard physics. So at every level of nature, there's this indeterminism, probability, which occurs in the breaking of waves, in the turbulent flow of fluids, in the behavior of the weather. That's why today, even with satellites and even with fancy computers, weather forecasters still quite often get it wrong, because there's an inherent indeterminism in it. The same is true of the activity of cells, of molecules, and of our brains, which are on the edge of chaos. There's a probabilism in the functioning of brains, which is not strictly determinate. Morphogenetic fields, I suggest, work by imposing patterns on probabilistic events. All sorts of things could happen, but the fields make one sort of thing happen rather than another. They impose a pattern, and that's how they work. They give form to otherwise indeterminate systems. Well, I'm suggesting that morphogenetic fields are present in all self-organizing systems, that our bodies are also organized by these fields. I shall talk later, after the break, about the way these fields manifest in behavior, in mental activity, and in social organization. But so far I'm confining this to bodies, the organization of bodies, what Aristotle would have called the vegetative soul, or the morphogenetic field, or what the theosophists may refer to as the etheric body, the organizing field of the body. So I think our bodies have organizing fields like any other body in nature. These fields are within and around our bodies, just as magnetic fields are within and around magnets. Perhaps these are what some people who see auras are seeing or detecting somehow. I don't know, because I don't see auras. But there are many esoteric traditions about the body being more extensive than simply the skin, that extending beyond the skin. However, it's the organizing ability of these fields that I'm interested in, and I think that we all have them. I think our bodies are coordinated by them. And this is where an experiment becomes possible to study these fields, which I'd like to mention here, because this is the epicenter of the therapeutic touch movement, which could be highly relevant to a simple experiment I've been developing. If we have fields for our bodies, these fields are within and around the bodies they organize. Normally, it's hard to investigate the fields separate from the body because they coincide, they're in the same place. And most measurements you make, my colleagues would say, oh, well, you're not measuring the field, you're just measuring electromagnetic effects of the body or chemicals. And so it's very hard to distinguish them experimentally. However, there's one situation in which you can have the field without the body, and that's when the body's disappeared in a region which is still occupied by a field. I'm referring to the phenomenon of phantom limbs. People who've had amputations of arms or legs nearly always have a phantom of the missing limb. And the phantom feels completely real. It feels as if it's still there. One of the problems people have after an amputation is they just can't believe that it isn't there. And when I was investigating this, I got hold of some literature from Veterans Administration hospitals, including a rather grisly booklet called What to Expect When You Lose a Limb, something that's given to people just before amputations. And one of the things this booklet says is that when you lose a limb, one of the things you have to be very careful of is in the first few days after the operation is it'll feel as if your leg's still there. And if you start trying, you'll try and walk on it. And if you do that, you'll fall flat on your face. They have a lot of problems in VA hospitals of people falling down after amputations because they try to walk on the limb. It feels so real. People with phantom arms find that even years after an operation, the phone rings and they reach out to pick it up. And then, of course, nothing happens because it's the phantom arm that's reaching out. Generally speaking, these phantoms shrink with time, but they persist throughout people's lives. There are people today who lost limbs in World War II who still have the phantoms. The first comprehensive study of phantom limbs was carried out by an American surgeon, Weir Mitchell, who studied phantoms in veterans of the American Civil War. This greatly interested William James, and some of the most interesting writings on phantoms are in the books of William James, because James realized that this had enormous theoretical implications. Well, if people have phantom limbs, what is going on? What is the phantom? The general medical view is that it's all inside the brain, that what happens is there are changes in the brain, that when you've got a phantom, there are nerve impulses from the stump that go up into the spinal cord, they activate the brain, and then you have a referred sensation to the limb, but it's actually all inside the head. It appears to be where the limb is, but it isn't, because it's all in the brain. Well, this is part of the view that all sensation and experience must be located in the brain. Those of you who were present at my lecture on Thursday will know that I think this doesn't apply even to our sensory experience. When you're looking at me now, I'm suggesting your image is located where it seems to me. It's not inside your head, it's projected out. I think our whole visual world is projected around us. And so I think our body image is present where it seems to be, in a field. It's not in the brain. Interestingly, in the medical literature, when people have lost limbs and they wear a prosthesis, an artificial arm or a leg, wearing the prosthesis is made much easier by the presence of the phantom. Even if the phantom has shrunk, when people start wearing a prosthesis, it grows again to fill the artificial limb. And in the medical literature, they say that the phantom animates the limb, which is a very interesting use of word. I think something like that really is happening. Now, the standard view, of course, is it's all in the brain. So when people experience a phantom arm, there's nothing really there. What I'm suggesting is that the phantom arm is the field of the missing arm. There's still the field there, even though the arm hasn't regenerated. Interestingly, in newts, if you cut off a limb, the limb does regenerate. This field guides a regenerative process. In people, this is somehow blocked. We don't know why. But the potential for regeneration might be there. And there are some medical researchers trying to increase our regenerative capacities. That's nowhere near happening now. But I think the field of the limb is there, and I think people with phantoms have a field where the limb appears to be. Well, now, if we could detect these fields, this would be a very interesting thing, because it would help to show there really is a field there, and it's not just in the brain. So how could you possibly detect a phantom limb? Well, when I got a clue to this when last time I came here, I met Dora Kuntz and the work they were doing on therapeutic touch, which I know a number of people here are practitioners of. Dora told me that sometimes they find that people with phantom limbs often have phantom pain, which is real enough, but it's not treatable by normal medical means. And some people who practice therapeutic touch have found that they can massage the phantom leg and actually relieve the phantom pain. Well, from a normal point of view, this is absolute nonsense. You're massaging something that's not there. But if the field of the limb is there, and if therapeutic touch is working with the fields of organs, and some of it involves moving the arms, not actually touching the body, therapeutic touch for some of the forms of it I've seen is the wrong word, because it doesn't involve actual physical touch, because it involves dealing with around the limb at a distance. I think it's interacting with the field. Then it might be possible to detect the fields of missing limbs. This is one of the experiments I proposed in my book, 7 Experiments That Could Change the World. I've since developed the technique. I've got a much simpler method than the one I proposed in that book. In the new edition just published, there's an appendix where I summarize progress so far. But roughly speaking, how the experiment works is this, and I'm mentioning it because I think it's something that perhaps some of you might be able to do. First, you have to find an amputee, someone with a missing arm. Now, that's not too difficult. A lot of people have lost arms, not just veterans, but also people who've had to have amputations because of accidents or even diabetes. So we recruited people with phantom limbs. I did this through appeals through a newsletter, the newsletter of the British Limbless Ex-Servicemen's Association. And I found that there were many ex-soldiers who are amputees who were very happy to take part in this research. Most amputees are really curious about phantoms and what's going on. They've all been told by doctors it's all in the brain, but that doesn't correspond to their experience. So then the question is, can the limb be detected? How we do the experiments is this. We get a door, an ordinary door, and now all these are low-cost experiments, or a partition, and we mark out 6 regions on it. We blue tack pieces of paper, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we do that on both sides of the door, then we shut the door. Then we have the person with the phantom on one side of the door. And We then throw a die to pick a number at random between 1 and 6. Say it comes up with 4. We ask the amputee to push their phantom arm through panel 4 in the door. And because they're phantoms, they go through solid objects. This is a common experience of amputees. The phantom will go through a solid, but it's a phantom, so it's not blocked by normal material barriers. So here the person pushes the phantom through panel 4. Now on the other side of the door, you've got what looks like an ordinary door, but one of these panels has a phantom sticking through it and the others don't. So then we ask people who might be sensitive to detecting these fields, which panel the phantom's sticking through. So they have to feel for all 6 panels and see whether they can feel this panel, this limb sticking through one panel, and they guess which panel it's sticking through, and they're right or they're wrong. By just guessing, they'd be right 1 time in 6. That's the chance expectation. In fact, in our experiments, people have been right significantly more than that. But the people who've done the guessing, I couldn't find any therapeutic touch practitioners in the places where we'd found the amputees. So we had to ask people who'd had no experience of working with phantoms, and they weren't very good at it. They were still above chance, but the results weren't terribly impressive. They might have been much better if we'd had people more experienced in working with phantoms. And that's an experiment which I think would be quite easy to do right here in Wheaton, or any of you who work in therapeutic touch, if you can find amputees, which isn't that difficult. Plenty of people with missing arms or legs. It'd be well worth trying that out, because it could have huge implications. We worked with dowsers and with people who were undergoing sort of various holistic training programs, but no one specifically who'd worked ever before with phantoms. That work could be enormously important, because the detection of a phantom, however people are doing it, above chance, would be the first step towards actually recognizing the reality of these fields. And the experiment's so simple that it costs nothing and it's fun to do. So I hope that some people here may be able to do it.
Okay, at the quantum level, things, it's possibilities.
Yes.
And then the possibilities become events or become materialized in some way. Then when and where is the form during the possibilities, and when does the form happen?
The question's about the relation to the quantum level, which is to do with possibilities. Well, this is getting into details which are rather hard to answer, but basically quantum physics says that quantum fields in quantum physics are fields of probability, and until something actually happens. In quantum theory, if you make a measurement of an electron, when you make the measurement, it's in one particular place. But before that, there's a field which it could be in lots of different places. So sometimes it's called the collapse of the wave function. Out of the many possibilities, only one actually occurs. I think morphic fields work by collapsing wave functions. There's this whole range of possibilities that any quantum system has, and everything's supposed to be a quantum system according to quantum physics. And these fields somehow make some things happen rather than others. So when a cell's going to divide, the microtubules, which are the little skeletal elements in the cell, could crystallize anywhere in the cell. There's a supersaturated solution of the subunits. But they'll crystallize in one place rather than another place, because I think these fields somehow impose a pattern on the many possibilities that are there. And then because there's a hierarchic organization, a field can make things happen in the area under its influence, but then that field is subject to influence from a higher level field of the organ over the tissue, over the cell. Exactly how this plays out in relation to the very details of quantum physics isn't known, because quantum physics doesn't really take into account this kind of causation at the moment. Many people, including Einstein, have felt that quantum physics was incomplete because this pure randomness that it leaves didn't seem to make sense in terms of nature. And I think that there is another form of causation, formative causation, that imposes pattern on it. The quantum physicist who I discussed this most with was David Bohm. David Bohm was very interested in these kinds of questions, and he and I had a number of dialogues on how morphic fields would relate to quantum physics. One of those dialogues is reprinted in the appendix to my book, A New Science of Life. And that actually took place at Ojai, where David Bohm and I stayed for a while with Krishnamurti, and there's some videos of us all talking together. But he was the person most interested in this, and I've since been exploring it with a German quantum physicist called Hans-Peter Dürr, D-U-R-R, who's at the Max Planck Institute in Munich. He's very open to this, and there are a number of quantum physicists who are convinced that quantum physics is incomplete, and to make sense of biology and chemistry needs to have some other system of causation that gives form, order, or pattern. So they're particularly open to this idea, but nobody's yet worked out how to bridge the gap between what I'm talking about as morphogenetic fields and the technical details of quantum physics. Yes?
Rupert, I understand that you're a fellow with IONS?
I'm a fellow of IONS, yes, Institute of Noetic Sciences.
And I understand that Edgar Mitchell has kind of a theory he's been evolving related to his experience that is somehow tied in with quantum holograms. Has that been influenced by your work? Have you been in conversation with him? Is there anything that kind of brings that together into your theories?
Well, I've met Edgar Mitchell, the founder of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. For those of you who don't know about it, noetic means, from the Greek word nous, means to do with consciousness. And it's an institute based in California that explores issues to do with consciousness. Many of its interests overlap with the Theosophical Society. He is interested in the holographic metaphor. And holograms provide a metaphor for interconnectedness and field patterns. I haven't actually personally discussed that with him, although I've met him. I think he took up the idea from David Bohm was interested in the holographic metaphor, and Karl Pribram in the context of brain action. So I think he was influenced by their use of this metaphor. It's only a metaphor, though, but it's one that suggests the interrelated and interconnected nature of things in the universe and the way that parts contain the whole in some sense, because I think the hologram is a field phenomenon. It's basically a field model. So there's quite a lot of overlap, but I don't know how much Edgar Mitchell has carried it through into kind of detailed scientific tests or anything like that. But there's certainly a common ground. That metaphor is a field metaphor that overlaps with what I'm doing. Let's have this gentleman.
Before I ask my question, I'd like to suggest a modification to your experiment with the amputees.
Yes.
Placing one amputee who's missing an arm on one side of the door, another amputee who's missing an arm on the opposite side of the door, and see if they can actually connect their fields together by essentially shaking hands through the
Well, that's an interesting idea. Somebody already suggested another modification, which is asking the amputee if they can feel when the person's hand goes through trying to feel there, whether they can detect things with their phantom. So I think that would be, yours is taking it one step further, where you'd have the phantoms themselves interacting. Most amputees are not experienced in trying to detect things with the phantom because they've been told by doctors it's all in the brain. All amputees, almost by definition, have been through the regular medical system and have been filled up with these ideas. So I'm not sure they wouldn't necessarily be that sensitive. Some animals may be more sensitive. I had some reports from some American veterans, because I appealed through various veterans organizations in the US for information. And one American veteran said that he had a little dog, and whenever he was sitting around, the dog would never go into the place occupied by his phantom leg. It was as if it could feel it was there. Animals may be particularly sensitive to this. And in doing research with amputees, it might be interesting to see whether cats and dogs can feel when they're touched by a phantom hand. Another modification of the experiment is that if it doesn't work through a door, one could try different kinds of barrier. It may be that different materials, plastic, wood, glass, etc., and metal, would have different effects on how the phantom can penetrate.